Right. If you're interested, there's a section in the book that goes into this in more detail than I'm going to be able to do here. But the basics is that because Aquinas differs with Aristotle on the doctrine of creation, Aquinas thinks creation is given, and it implies that everything that exists that is not God exists by relationship with God. And Aristotle believes in the eternity of the universe, right? Because of the doctrine of creation,
it's not given. Then it's just
right.
Okay.
Yeah, it just is, right? For Aquinas, what changes with substance then is substance is an independently existing reality, right? Accidents depend on substance, but substance stands independently. But for Thomas Aquinas, and this sounds a little weird, but I think it's right, independence is given. God gives to things they're in. So our independence as existing entities is dependent on God's creating, and so our independence is dependent. And what that means is that an independently existing substance of bread or wine, in this case, are still only existing by participation in God's act of creation, which means that God's creative act could change their identity. And in fact, so for Thomas Aquinas, the best theological analogy for transubstantiation is actually the doctrine of creation, which he goes back to more than once in his explication of this. And in fact, to the point where the relationship of God's speech is actually invoked, right? So in the Bible, God creates by speaking, and the same thing happens at the consecration of the Eucharist, right? God gives something its identity by sort of declaring it to be the thing that it is, you know? That's all far beyond what Aristotle would have imagined. You know, for Aristotle, you couldn't have the accidents of bread and wine without the substance of bread and wine. That would have been an incoherent sort of statement. But it's only within Thomas's doctrine of creation where everything exists by participation in God, and God is the one who grants identity. Only in that worldview can the use of Aristotle's categories to explicate this make any sense. So it's yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So in Aristotle, creation is a permanent state of independence in the sense that it's past eternal. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert in Aristotle.
So it's a permanent independence.
There's a prime mover who kind of organized it the way it is, but it's the creation itself has always existed, right?
Yeah, and then so we have with
the universe has already existed. Yeah.
Aquinas, though, we have this state of independence that is a function or flows out of dependence,
right?
And so is it that in transubstantiation now God is taking that independence and recreating it, or I don't know if the creation is the right analogy, but
right. Thomas has this wild line which is often missed, where he describes the change as God taking away from this what kept it from being that. God, so transubstantiation at one point is described as a taking something away from the bread and wine. And I think the best read of that is that what he takes away is their independence. So everything exists by dependence on creation in Christ, and points beyond itself to deeper realities. But here there's almost like a shortcut. Like this particular element of creation is now elevated to the degree that it shows forth. Well, it loses its independence so that it shows forth God's presence, which is in all of creation in a sense, right? But is shown forth in a sort of unique way. And so this is like, you can get eschatological with this, right? So that, you know, the Christ being all in all that we hear in St. Paul. This is like a foretaste of Christ being all in all. So the last line of my book is something about God gathering all creation to himself, bread first. That's the sort of cheeky poetic line I used at the end, right? It's the first, or the first fruits, that's biblical language of the new creation, right?
Yeah, well, that reminds me of a verse in John's Gospel, which is gather up all the fragments. Right, and the word there is synagoge for like gather. It's like this gathering together all the fragments, so nothing to be lost. But okay,
right,
this is God all. So if we go back to substance as standing under, so is this now the independence of that, what was standing under these accidents is now, I guess, revoked and replaced with the standing under now is the body of Christ.
right, yeah, and the blood in the case of the wine, and the body in the case of the bread. But yeah, and then we get to this doctrine of concomitance. We can receive under both species, but we don't think that we only get part of Jesus if we receive under one species.
Yeah, so how does that work?
And this follows on the sacramental logic. So Brett's earlier comments about eating kneecaps, right?
Yeah.
One mistake is to understand every molecule or fragment or whatever of the bread or drop of wine as like part of Christ. But substance, Thomas says, is present whole in the whole and whole in the part. So a loaf of bread or a crumb of bread are both equivalent in their capacity to signify bread to us. Our intellect can perceive bread in a loaf or a slice or a crumb. And if our senses can perceive bread, then when our senses are informed by faith and the words of consecration that this is my body, then we can, whatever we could perceive as bread, we can now perceive as the body of Christ. And so Christ is as present in a small host or a large host, in a crumb or a loaf. You can't get like a small piece, like, and we all kind of know this, right? You don't think like, oh, I got a bigger chunk of host than somebody else, so I got more Jesus today.
I think some people actually might think that way, but
they might. But they would probably be relieved to find out that that's a mistake.
Right.
And so, but see, the logic there is symbolic, right? If it is enough to sign or to signify to our intellect, then that's sufficient. And actually, the same principle works. This question we have, like, how long does the presence persist after you consume, right? Yeah. Well, and then there's actually an old word for people who were worried that Jesus ended up in the sewer. They're called stercoronists, right? But here's the thing: nobody worries that bread ends up in the sewer.
So what is stercoronist? Like, what does that mean? Or
oh shoot, I've forgotten the etymology, but it has to do with defecation.
Sure. Okay. Fair. We can leave it at that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we can leave it at that. But no one is like, oh, we're wasting so much food because people go to the bathroom. Right. So no one thinks, oh, we're wasting bread, or we're worried that bread is ending up in the toilet.
Yeah.
Well, according to Thomas, the predication is the same, right? Whenever you would say bread stops existing in the normal process of human digestion, that's when you would say the body of Christ stops, because it's predicated on our ability to recognize bread as bread. And so the standard answer is something like 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah. I don't know. When my kids start eating food, it's pretty instant. But that this is no longer food after it's come back in the mouth. But okay, so
and we were discussing this too about how, like, if you really, like, in my experience, people do kind of know this, but you maybe they haven't always thought about this. Because people know, servers at Mass know, you're not supposed to let even a crumb of the Eucharist fall.
Right. Yeah.
Because it has the fullness of Jesus in it. Yeah. But what would that mean? If Jesus has his kneecaps, right, in the Eucharist. So I liked your image. Is he Ant-Manning into each individual molecule in its fullness, but also somehow all the molecules together are also making the fullness of Jesus, even though his body's, he is fully present in each one. But if you think of it too materialistically, it leads you into a whole bunch of like weird, unnecessary
Autobots.
Or like or what are the Power Rangers or whatever, or Captain Planet, with their powers combined, they make one Jesus, So I want to talk about at this point. we'll come back to transubstantiation, I hope, but again, broadly, why the idea of substance is so important generally. I want to talk about two kind of philosophical strains here.
Right.
One that denies the existence of substance, which some people might say, they might be like, hey, look, you're bringing in Aristotle, he's a foreign philosopher, he's not, this isn't emerging organically out of theology or the Bible.
Right.
Well, here's why, or it's not, Aristotle articulates it nicely, but actually, if you deny substance, it leads you into weird problems. So we'll talk in a minute about the misdefinition of substance, but let's get into what happens if you deny substance. And it's important to know here, like, again, and this goes to what you were saying, there's substance and then there's 9 different kinds of accidents, right? Which I have pulled up because I was afraid I'd forget one. Those are quantity, quality, relation, habitus, which is what you have, like we're all wearing clothes right now. That's an attribute we have, even though it's not like, substantially true, it's accidentally true. Time, that's interesting. Time is an accident, right? Where you're located in time. Location, right? And this is important too, because some people will wonder, well, how can Jesus be like in heaven? This was a thing.
Right. That's a really big one in the tradition.
That was a big one. It was like, he's ascended into heaven. How can he also be here?
Right.
How can he be locally present or whatever? Position or situation, and then action and passion, like acting and being acted upon. Those are all accidents. So it's worth remembering, we're using kind of straightforward examples like, well, color or your hair or things like that. But accident does go more broadly than that, right? It has to do with time and location. Those are all also accidents. So knowing that it's Jesus's body is a substance that's different than those things, that's also really helpful, I think, actually, to imagine how he can be in so many places at once, I guess, let's say.
Right. So the reformers all think that Catholics believe in a local presence, and then they reject that. And Calvin in particular is really keen to affirm that the ascension means that Christ is present at the right hand of the Father. And the ironic thing is, you go read Thomas Aquinas and he says exactly what Calvin says. And so it's really interesting to show Calvinists this, because they've been given to understand that Aquinas teaches this sort of local presence, but for just the reason you highlighted, because for Thomas, location is accidental, he doesn't need a local presence to have a real presence.
Right.
And it's worth noting, this gets, beyond this into other theological things, but Calvin has this weird, his whole Eucharistic idea, like he thinks the finite cannot contain the infinite. And there's the implications of this are that in the Gospel of John, when Jesus shows up in the room, even though the doors are locked, Calvin actually says, well, he came in some other way, because it would have been impossible for his body to go through a locked door. Like that's
right.
So there's whole other things that are going on with that. I want to go back to what happens if you deny the idea of substance, right? Because that's kind of what someone like John Locke does. John Locke is an empiricist, right? Now again, Aquinas is considered an empiricist too, but he's like a rational empiricist. Yeah. He believes our active intellect can abstract the fact that there are substances and deposit that in our passive intellect and everything. Yeah. Someone like John Locke is an empiricist in the sense that we can only know what our senses can perceive.
Right.
Which then, that does leave the question of, well, matter itself, if you want to think of it this way, we never directly see. I think John Locke calls it an I know not what, like a je ne sais quoi.
Yeah. Well, because instead of having the categories of accident and substance, he has like primary and secondary qualities. So it's almost as if he's collapsing
exactly
substance and accident into primary.
Quality is an accident, according to Aristotle.
Yeah.
So he's taking one kind of accident and just kind of parsing primary and secondary forms of that, which is arguably just a different way of saying substance and accident that he's trying to make acceptable to empiricists. But again, it'd be a substance that is reducible to what we can kind of see. This leads into like David Hume and his bundle theory, where so we were saying earlier, that you're not just, you never say you just see red. For Hume, kind of you do. He really does sort of say all you ever have are a bundle of sensations. So I actually don't know that I'm looking at you, like at Gerard McLarney right now. Right. I can see like a nice peachish shade and a nice kind of gleam coming off the top of that pinkish shade, right? And a very fashionable looking like kind of brown and black. But like I call that lump of colors Gerard McLarney for like convenience, but I don't actually know of anything beyond that.
Right.
All I know are like the sense impressions that I'm kind of getting. Yeah. Which scholastics have pointed out that kind of just leads to, well, first of all, there's a few problems. The two major ones are, first of all, that leads to total skepticism. Right. Because I can't know I wouldn't really be able to know anything beyond my like sense impressions that I know are often inaccurate. And also this goes to the point of that's kind of just redefining substance. Like that's really just saying
Right.
substance is the thing I'm physically looking at.
Yeah. Right.
And this, we were discussing this before we turned the camera on, but like William James says this about like ourselves. Like so this is what happens if you deny substance. If I'm just a collection of juices flowing through meat with like electrical charges running through it, and I have a skeleton to support it, I don't have a soul, right? I just have a series of like thoughts that I'm having, and he coins this term stream of consciousness. Like that's all. I'm not like a self. I'm just like one thought after another, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, that has the result of destroying ourselves. It's the Heraclitus thing. I can never jump in the same river twice, and I'm not the same person from moment to moment.
Because I'm thinking new
It's
thought.
always a new thought that I'm having. Exactly. Now, as Dr. Brett kind of pointed out, that's really unintuitive. Like that just doesn't seem true. Like obviously, I must have some continuity. But then another point that our friend John Noonan, the scholastic philosopher of the 1950s, said, even that, all that does is the way he phrases it, all James has succeeded in doing is making a substance out of the individual thought. Right. So like the thought I'm having right now, that just becomes the new substance. So everyone kind of has to fall into some kind of substance theory, right? You have to posit some permanent thing, something. What was it like? Something that's not underlying. Something else isn't underlying it.
Yeah, well, something has to be standing under all those thoughts.
Exactly.
Right. Because if they're just flowing, well, then what are you?
Right. It's a substance that only exists for a moment and is replaced by another substance every single second.
Yeah.
So everyone, you have to believe in substance. You kind of can't not believe in it. Aristotle's articulation of it is just the one that makes the most sense. That's the clearest way of talking about it, which again goes back to it's the most apt. Like how can we best explain what's going on in the Eucharist? The most apt way is that it seems like substance works this way, and Aristotle's account of substance, everyone has to affirm substance in some sense. His doesn't fall into nonsense and error, the same way that all these other ones kind of do.
Right.
The other big mistake that I would say is with our friend Descartes. All right. So it was teaching Descartes that made me think of this and made me say, we got to get Dr. Brett on to talk about this.
Okay.
I'll just give a quick rundown. Everyone kind of knows this, right? He's trying to prove that body and soul are separate from each other. What noble goal, right? He's a good Christian apologist trying to prove that the soul exists and it's immortal, right? But to do this, he kind of rejects scholastic metaphysics, and he redefines substance as being identical to its primary accident, right? So for him, so this is the point he's making. He has this interesting chapter in his meditations about like a wax, right? And it's like, well, right now it's hard, but if I put it by the fire, it'll melt and it'll look completely different.
Right.
And you think the point he's making going for is he's talking about the difference between substance and accidents. He's saying that, the wax is a substance, but all the accidents can always change. But actually the point he's going for is, well, you know what never changes? It's always extended in place. Right. There's always there's always some degree of extension with any material body.
Sounds like dimentiveness.
It sounds like exactly. It sounds like maybe the dimentive property, right? So therefore, definitionally, a material body must be a body that's extended in space. Then he makes this whole famous argument, I think, therefore I am. Well, my mind isn't occupying any space. It's thinking. That's all it's doing is thinking. Oh, well, then mind must be defined by its primary accident, which is that it thinks. Therefore, mind and body are two separate substances, and therefore I have a soul, right?
Well, and he defines us as thinking substances.
Exactly, right.
That's what a human is.
Right, a thinking substance, which is kind of using this material substance that's extended in time as like what was it, the Power Rangers, like the robot suit, like we're riding that around. Now, again, we can appreciate what he's going for, but one of the big problems with that is, and this was pointed out at the time, what does that do to the Eucharist? Right? Because if it's necessary for a substance to be extended in space, then we're back to this problem of how, if even like a microscopic particle of the Eucharist is the fullness of Christ's body, how is that possible if Christ's body has to be extended in space? Right. How can it be present all over the world? And potentially in other planets, if we have the Eucharist on the moon or something, and still be present in heaven, if the definition of a body is that it has extension in space, so that's just one problem with that definition. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Dr. Brett.
Yeah, I mean, if Descartes' definitions were the operative definitions in the time of Thomas Aquinas and the generation or two before him, then substance never would have been chosen for this work in Eucharistic theology. It would have been a bad tool. And so, you just have to be aware, like when words change their meanings, then they stop working the way they worked before. So, I mean, yeah, so it just strikes me that, yeah, Descartes is taking these words that have this sort of pedigree. He's not the first one in this direction. I mean, before the Reformation, substance was already migrating in this direction, and that's part of what made transubstantiation incoherent to the reformers and why they reject things that Thomas Aquinas himself rejects without realizing that Thomas rejected them. They think Thomas taught those things. But he's almost like the perfect capstone of it. Like he sort of made it official for modern, usage of the term. And then we'd need some other way of talking about the Eucharist, because that doesn't work.
That doesn't wash, yeah.
And then the other thing that follows, I think, is the anthropology there. Like, what kind of a thing is a human person, and what is our relationship with our bodies? I'm curious. I don't know this, but just as you were talking, Brett, I'm thinking like, okay, I've been to funerals where even the priest described that now this person is an angel, like their body rots in the ground and now they're an angel in heaven, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, so like the resurrection of the body insists that we're not fully ourselves without our bodies, right? That like we're an integrated unit, body and soul. And it seems to me that this way of speaking makes our bodies sort of accidental to our identities.
Right.
And so the resurrection of the body becomes like not even something that registers. Like lots of good Catholics just think that souls go to heaven or we become angels or something like angels or whatever else. And then you have other, contemporary cultural currents related to other things altogether that just treat our bodies as sort of like shells open to any kind of manipulation, but they don't actually define us, right? What defines us is the immaterial thought, or today feeling. That's the real thing. That's the real you, is the feeling. And if your body doesn't match that, well, then it's not your body. It's a kind of a mistake, or it's something like that, right? So it just seems to me that once you divide body and soul, that he's trying to prove you have a soul, but he proves too much. He ends up proving that you don't really have a body,
which makes
or if you do, it's not really. It's only accidental to your identity.
Which almost makes you wonder, then why do we need to eat Christ's body? If our body,
what would be? Why bother?
Are like, no pun intended, but they're so immaterial, like they're so unimportant, right? Yes. Then why would it be so important for us to eat Christ's body, which is also a direction we see with I guess a lot of Protestant traditions, maybe some Catholics too, of like, well, I don't need the sacraments even, right? Like the body's not that important. Christ's body's not that important. My body's not that important. What matters is the inner light or something, right? That I'm experiencing. Right?
You don't need tradition. You don't need community. You don't need all kinds of things that happen in time and space, because you're a head on a stick. The only thing that matters and what defines you is what you think. Right. Which is actually ends up being completely naive, right? I mean, nobody has shown us this better than like the advertising agencies, right? They're like, we actually don't make decisions based on what we think. We make decisions based in a much richer matrix of sort of feelings and impressions and goals and desires and loves and whatever else. But we lie to ourselves and we say, well, what I think is actually the real me. Is completely naive. I mean, we're totally prone before, advertisers if we believe this about ourselves.
And that weakness, I think, goes back to what you're saying about Hume, that we're just sentiment, right? Or we're just perceived. It's through our sentiment, right? And that's where he gets to, reason must be the slave of the passions, and by that he means. This is how we, based on our impressions, that we get from our ideas.
It might not be obvious how that's related to substance, but it is in the sense of if all we have are sense impressions, and like reason doesn't have this ability to discern something beyond it. Well, reason's kind of just it's a slave of sense of what you call it, like reactions, or stimuli. And in the same way, that'd be the same with our morality. It's just a reaction to this emotional stimuli.
Yeah, and that's exactly how he frames his morality, right? You get this impression for what it is, and later on you come up with reasons for it, and so on.